The Stranger in the Rain. The gray sky loomed heavy over the city as Sarah Benson stepped out of the corner diner, her shift finally over. Rain slicked the streets, the droplets forming tiny rivers along the curves. Sarah pulled her coat tighter around her, clutching her umbrella in one hand and her bag in the other. The familiar exhaustion weighed her down after another grueling 12-hour shift, but tonight felt different, like something was waiting just around the corner. Her thoughts were elsewhere as she walked through the drizzle. Rent was overdue again. Her boss, a gruff man who rarely looked her in the eye, had made it clear she was hanging by a thread. Yet she couldn't bring herself to quit. Jobs were hard to come by in this city, and she needed every penny to make it through the month. The streets were mostly deserted, save for the occasional car that splashed water onto the sidewalk. Sarah quickened her pace, eager to get home, when a faint groan cut through the sound of the rain. She froze, her ears straining to locate the source. "Help!" The voice came again, weak and trembling. She turned, scanning the dimly lit street. At first, she saw nothing. Then, by the faint glow of a flickering street lamp, she spotted him. A man slumped against a wall, his head drooping to his chest. His clothes were soaked, his expensive suit clinging to his frame, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. "Sir," she called out, stepping closer. He didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling unevenly. Sarah's heart raced. This wasn't something she could ignore, but panic clawed at her throat. What if he was dangerous? What if someone else was lurking nearby, waiting for her to let her guard down? Still, she couldn't leave him there. With trembling hands, she knelt beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice firm but gentle. The man's eyes fluttered open for a split second, glassy and unfocused. "Help me," he whispered again before his head lolled to the side. Sarah's mind raced. She reached into her bag, fumbling for her phone, and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice guided her through the steps, and Sarah relayed their location. The ambulance would take a few minutes to arrive, but every second felt like an eternity. She crouched beside the stranger, shielding him from the rain with her umbrella. The minutes dragged on, the sound of distant sirens finally breaking the silence. Relief flooded her as the ambulance rounded the corner, its flashing lights cutting through the gloom. The paramedics were efficient, moving the man onto a stretcher and into the vehicle with practiced ease. One of them paused to speak to Sarah. "Are you a relative?" he asked, his tone brisk but kind. "No," Sarah replied. "I just found him." The paramedic nodded. "He's lucky you did. Looks like severe exhaustion and dehydration, maybe more. You might have just saved his life." As the ambulance sped away, Sarah stood alone in the rain, her umbrella sagging in her hand. The gravity of what had just happened weighed on her. She didn't know who he was or what had led him to that state, but something about his frailty, his vulnerability, struck a chord deep within her. When she finally made it home, her apartment felt colder than usual. The heater had given out weeks ago, and the landlord hadn't responded to her requests for repairs. She sat on her worn-out couch, her mind replaying the events of the evening. There was something about the man's face, his sharp features softened by the rain, that lingered in her thoughts. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was her best friend, Mia. "Hey, you okay?" Mia's voice was warm, concerned. "You never call after work." Sarah hesitated before recounting the night's events. Mia listened intently, her concern turning into admiration. "You did the right thing," Mia said firmly. "Most people would have walked right by. You have a good heart, Sarah." Sarah smiled faintly, though the weight of her actions still pressed on her. "I hope he's okay. He's lucky you found him. That says a lot about you." As the call ended, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She had no way of knowing that the stranger she had saved would soon turn her life upside down in ways she could never imagine. The next morning, Sarah woke to the blaring sound of her alarm. Her body ached, but she forced herself out of bed. The memory of the previous night lingered as she prepared for another day. At the diner, her coworkers buzzed with gossip about a big-name tech CEO who had been admitted to the hospital under mysterious circumstances. "I heard he collapsed on the street," one of them whispered. "Can you imagine? A billionaire just lying there like a regular person." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the same man? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. The city was full of people, and the odds were slim. But as the day went on, curiosity gnawed at her. During her lunch break, she pulled out her phone and searched for the news. The articles confirmed her suspicions. The man she had found was Lucas Hawthorne, the enigmatic CEO of Hawthorne Technologies, a company known for its cutting-edge innovations and his fiercely private nature. Sarah's mind raced. She had saved someone important, someone who could buy her entire building without blinking an eye. But what did that mean for her? Would he remember her? Would he even care? The questions followed her home that night, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. She had no way of knowing that the act of kindness she had thought would be forgotten was about to open a door to a world she never dreamed of entering. The cost of compassion. The steady hum of fluorescent lights filled the hospital corridor as Sarah paced back and forth, clutching a small bouquet of daisies she had hastily picked up from a street vendor. She hadn't planned on coming here. In fact, she had spent most of the morning convincing herself not to. But something gnawed at her, a sense of unfinished business, of responsibility. Lucas Hawthorne. She had learned his name last night while scrolling through headlines. Every article painted him as a titan of industry, a genius who had reshaped the tech world. Yet beneath all the accolades and achievements, no one seemed to know much about him personally. His privacy was almost legendary, and that only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Sarah stopped in front of his room, her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced through the small window in the door. He was there, lying motionless on the hospital bed, his face still pale but less gaunt than the night before. Machines beeped rhythmically around him, a fragile symphony of life. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was sterile and quiet, save for the soft rustle of the nurse adjusting his IV. The woman looked up, her expression neutral but curious. "Are you family?" the nurse asked, her tone polite but firm. "No," Sarah replied quickly. I was the one who found him." The nurse's expression softened. "Ah, you're the Good Samaritan. He's stable for now, but we still don't know much. No ID, no next of kin listed. Do you know him?" Sarah shook her head. "Not really. I couldn't leave him there." The nurse nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Well, you did a good thing. Most people wouldn't have stopped." As the nurse left, Sarah moved hesitantly toward the bed. Up close, Lucas looked even younger than she'd imagined, perhaps mid-30s, though the faint lines on his forehead suggested the weight of responsibility beyond his years. She placed the daisies on the bedside table, feeling slightly foolish. What was she even doing here? "Hi," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I just wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay." She sat down in the chair by the bed, folding her hands in her lap. The silence was deafening, and she found herself rambling to fill it. "I'm Sarah, by the way. I work at a diner downtown. Well, I work there for now. Who knows how long that'll last." She let out a nervous laugh. "Anyway, I saw you last night, and you looked like you needed help. I couldn't just walk away." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. She told him about her long hours, her mounting bills, and the nagging fear that she was barely holding her life together. It felt strange to open up to someone who couldn't respond, but it was oddly comforting. Hours passed before she realized how long she had been there. She stood abruptly, smoothing her coat. "I should go," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But I'll come back. Just hang in there, okay?" As she left the hospital, Sarah felt a mix of emotions, relief that he was stable, but also an odd connection she couldn't explain. She told herself it was just a sense of duty, a need to see things through. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The next few days blurred together. Sarah's shifts at the diner were grueling, the stress of her financial situation ever present. Yet she found herself returning to the hospital each evening. It became a routine. Finishing her shift, grabbing a cup of coffee, and sitting by Lucas's bedside. She brought books to read aloud, filling the silence with stories of distant worlds and grand adventures. She shared anecdotes about her life, her struggles, her dreams. She even joked about how she might need to charge him rent for all the time she spent in his room. The nurses began to notice her frequent visits. One of them, an older woman named Margaret, took Sarah aside one evening. "You've got a good heart," Margaret said, her voice warm. "But you should know, people like him, they live in a different world. If he wakes up, he might not even remember you." Sarah nodded, her throat tightening. She knew Margaret was right, but it didn't stop her from coming back. On the fifth evening, something changed. Sarah was reading from The Great Gatsby, her voice soft but steady, when she noticed a faint twitch in Lucas's hand. She froze, the book slipping from her grasp. "Lucas," she whispered, leaning forward. His eyelids fluttered, his brow furrowing slightly. Then, for the briefest moment, his eyes opened. They were a deep, piercing blue, and they locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "You're in the hospital," Sarah said quickly, her heart racing. "You collapsed, but you're okay now. You're safe." Lucas blinked slowly, as if trying to process her words. His lips parted, but no sound came out. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling. "Just rest. You're going to be fine." The nurse rushed in moments later, and Sarah stepped back, watching as they checked his vitals. The room buzzed with activity, but all she could focus on was the fact that he had opened his eyes. He had seen her. As she left the hospital that night, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, hope, and something she couldn't quite name. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. The next day, Sarah arrived at the hospital to find Lucas sitting up in bed, his color much improved. A man in a tailored suit stood by his side, speaking in hushed tones. The moment Sarah entered, their conversation stopped, and both men turned to look at her. "You must be Sarah," the man in the suit said, his voice smooth and professional. "I'm Daniel, Lucas's assistant. He's been asking about you." Sarah's gaze shifted to Lucas, who was watching her intently. There was a quiet strength in his eyes now, a far cry from the fragile man she had found on the street. "Thank you," Lucas said, his voice steady but laced with emotion, "for saving me. I don't even know how to begin repaying you." Sarah felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "You don't have to repay me. I couldn't leave you there." Lucas's lips curved into a faint smile. "Not many people would have done what you did. You gave me a second chance." Daniel cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Lucas, we need to discuss the media strategy. The press is already sniffing around." Lucas nodded but kept his eyes on Sarah. "Can we talk later, Daniel? I'd like a moment alone with her." Daniel hesitated before nodding and leaving the room. For the first time, Sarah and Lucas were alone, and the air between them felt charged with unspoken words. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. "Tell me about yourself," Lucas said, his voice soft but commanding. "I owe you that much." And so, for the next hour, Sarah told him everything, her struggles, her dreams, and the moment she found him in the rain. Lucas listened intently, his expression unreadable but his gaze never wavering. When she finished, he leaned back against the pillows, his eyes thoughtful. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly, "but you didn't let it stop you from helping me. That says more about you than you realize." Sarah shrugged, trying to brush off the compliment. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Lucas said firmly. "You did far more than that, and I won't forget it." As Sarah left the hospital that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. An unlikely bond. The world outside the hospital was bustling, yet inside Lucas's recovery room, time seemed to stretch and bend, slowed by the weight of unspoken words and tentative connections. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Lucas Hawthorne had woken up, his once fragile state replaced by a slow but steady recovery. For Sarah, the routine of her daily visits had shifted. What started as an obligation to check on him out of sheer concern had morphed into something more complicated, a bond she hadn't anticipated. That morning, as Sarah stepped into the hospital lobby, balancing a tray of coffee and a bag of muffins, she caught sight of Daniel, Lucas's assistant, pacing near the elevator bank. His usually calm and collected demeanor had been replaced with an anxious energy that was impossible to miss. "Daniel," she called out, quickening her steps. He turned to her, his sharp suit slightly rumpled, and gave her a tight smile. "Sarah, you're here earlier than usual. I thought I'd bring some breakfast," she said, lifting the tray in her hand. "Is everything okay?" Daniel hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the elevator. "It's complicated." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how?" He sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "Lucas has been stubborn. The doctors recommended more rest, but he's already talking about resuming work. I think he's trying to prove something, to himself, to the board. You know how driven he is." Sarah didn't know, not really. But she had glimpsed enough of Lucas's determination in the past week to believe it. She thought of the way he had insisted on standing during her last visit, despite the nurse's protests, his jaw set in defiance as if sheer willpower alone could speed up his recovery. "I'll see if I can talk to him," she said softly, her voice tinged with concern. Daniel gave her a grateful nod. "Good luck. He listens to you more than anyone else right now." The elevator ride to Lucas's floor felt longer than usual. Sarah's thoughts swirled with memories of their recent conversations, the sharp wit beneath his formal exterior, the glimpses of vulnerability he allowed her to see, and the subtle way he always seemed to redirect the conversation away from himself. When she entered his room, Lucas was sitting upright in bed, his laptop balanced precariously on his knees. Papers and folders were scattered across the small table beside him, creating a makeshift office in the sterile hospital environment. "You're supposed to be resting," Sarah said, crossing the room and placing the coffee and muffins on the table. Lucas glanced up, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Resting is overrated." "Overrated," she echoed, arching an eyebrow. "You nearly work yourself to death, and you think resting is overrated." He smirked, closing the laptop with a soft click. "I appreciate your concern, but there's a lot riding on me getting back to work. Hastings Industries doesn't exactly run itself." Sarah pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. "I get that you're important. Believe me, the headlines have made that clear. But you can't do much for your company if you push yourself too hard and end up back here." Lucas's expression softened, and for a moment, he seemed almost human, stripped of the larger-than-life persona the media had built around him. "You sound like Daniel," he admitted. "He's been hounding me about slowing down too." "Maybe because we're right," Sarah shot back, offering him a muffin. "And because we care." Lucas hesitated before taking the muffin, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Why?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." The question caught her off guard. She could have given him a dozen different answers. Because she couldn't stand the thought of walking past someone in need, because she had been in dark places herself and knew what it was like to feel alone. But instead, she opted for honesty. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe because you looked like you needed someone to care." Lucas studied her, his piercing gaze searching for something she wasn't sure she could give. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, not the polite, rehearsed smile she had seen in news articles, but something real, something unguarded. "Thank you," he said softly, the words carrying more weight than she expected. Over the next few days, Sarah's visits became the highlight of both their routines. Lucas seemed to relish her company, often steering their conversations toward her life instead of his own. He asked about her dreams, her struggles, her reasons for staying in the city despite the challenges. Sarah, in turn, found herself drawn to the man beneath the corporate veneer. Lucas was intelligent, of course, but he was also surprisingly funny, his dry humor catching her off guard more than once. She learned about his love for classic literature, his knack for chess, and his complicated relationship with his late father, who had built Hastings Industries from the ground up. One evening, as they played a makeshift game of chess using a borrowed set from the nurse's lounge, Lucas leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "You should work for me," he said suddenly, moving a knight across the board. Sarah blinked, caught completely off guard. "What?" "You're smart, resourceful, and you clearly know how to handle pressure," Lucas said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I could use someone like you on my team." She laughed nervously. "I'm a waitress, Lucas. What do I know about working in a tech company?" "More than you think," he replied, his gaze steady. "You've been navigating challenges your whole life. That kind of resilience is invaluable." The sincerity in his voice left her speechless. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her not as a waitress struggling to make ends meet, but as someone with potential, someone worth believing in. The offer stayed with her long after she left the hospital that night. As she lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her tiny apartment, she replayed his words over and over. Could she really leave behind the safety of the familiar, even if the familiar was a dead-end job? Could she step into a world so far removed from her own and hope to succeed? The next morning, Sarah returned to the hospital with her decision. "I'll do it," she told Lucas, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "But on one condition." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "You have to promise me something," she said, her gaze steady. "No pushing yourself too hard. If I'm going to work for you, I need to know you'll take care of yourself too." A slow smile spread across his face. "Deal." As Sarah left his room, a strange sense of hope settled over her. For the first time in years, the path ahead didn't seem quite so daunting. Instead, it felt like a new beginning, a chance to rewrite her story. Little did she know, accepting Lucas's offer would not only change her life, but would also reveal secrets that would test her resilience, her loyalty, and her heart in ways she never could have imagined. New beginnings, old wounds. The towering glass skyscraper of Hastings Industries shimmered in the morning sunlight, a beacon of ambition and success. Sarah stood at its base, clutching the strap of her modest handbag, her nerves frayed as she tilted her head to take in the sheer height of the building. This was not her world. Not yet. Inside, the air hummed with the rhythm of a corporate giant. Polished marble floors, sleek modern decor, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee painted a picture of precision and power. People moved with purpose, their conversations clipped and efficient. Sarah felt like an outsider in her simple blouse and pencil skirt, a sharp contrast to the tailored suits and designer dresses that surrounded her. "Sarah Benson," a voice called out, breaking through her thoughts. She turned to see Daniel, Lucas's assistant, approaching her with his usual brisk efficiency. Today he looked less frazzled and more in control, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to her nerves. "Welcome," he said, offering a firm handshake. "Lucas is tied up in a meeting, but I'm here to show you around and get you settled." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you. I appreciate it." Daniel led her through the labyrinth of hallways, pointing out key areas: the boardroom, the executive lounge, Lucas's personal office. The building's design was sleek and minimalist, every inch of it exuding wealth and sophistication. Sarah couldn't help but feel like she didn't belong. When they reached her new workspace, a small but well-appointed desk just outside Lucas's office, Daniel handed her a neatly organized binder. "Your role is primarily as Lucas's executive assistant," he explained. Scheduling meetings, managing correspondence, and ensuring he doesn't push himself too hard. He trusts you, which is more than I can say for most people here. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Why's that? Daniel hesitated before replying. Lucas doesn't let people in easily. He's built walls, probably thicker than this building's foundation. But you're different. His words lingered as Sarah settled into her desk, organizing the supplies and reviewing the first task in the binder. The magnitude of her new role hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to prove herself in a world far removed from her diner days. By midday, Sarah was fully immersed in the whirlwind of her new position. She scheduled back-to-back meetings, fielded calls from high-profile clients, and learned the intricacies of Lucas's preferences. Black coffee, no sugar, meetings no longer than 30 minutes unless absolutely necessary, and a strict no interruptions policy when he was deep in thought. Lucas emerged from his office just after lunch, looking sharper and more composed than she'd seen him at the hospital. He glanced at her desk, then at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Settling in?" he asked, his tone casual but warm. "Trying to," Sarah replied, standing instinctively. "It's a lot." Lucas chuckled softly. "You'll get the hang of it. If anyone can keep up, it's you." His confidence in her felt like a lifeline. She nodded, determined not to let him down. But as the day wore on, she realized just how high the stakes were. Lucas's world was relentless, a constant stream of emails, calls, and crises. She barely had time to breathe, let alone think about anything else. That evening, as Sarah packed up her things, she overheard two employees whispering near the elevator bank. "Did you see the new girl? How did she land a job like this? I heard Lucas personally hired her. Must have been some favor." The words stung, even though she had expected whispers and judgments. She kept her head down, pretending not to hear, but their voices followed her long after she left the building. Back at her apartment, Sarah sank onto her couch, the weight of the day settling over her. She thought of her coworkers at the diner, their easy camaraderie and lighthearted banter. Here, the stakes were different, the atmosphere charged with ambition and cutthroat competition. And though Lucas believed in her, Sarah couldn't help but feel like she was constantly walking a tightrope, one misstep away from falling. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and early mornings. Sarah's days revolved around Lucas's demanding schedule, her own needs taking a backseat to the relentless pace of Hastings Industries. Yet she found herself thriving under the pressure. She discovered an aptitude for problem-solving, her resourcefulness honed by years of navigating life's challenges. Lucas, for his part, proved to be both mentor and enigma. He guided her when needed but never micromanaged, trusting her to make decisions on her own. Their dynamic grew more comfortable, their conversations tinged with a familiarity that bordered on friendship. One evening, as they worked late on a major presentation for a potential investor, Lucas glanced at her across the table. "You've adapted quickly," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Most people would have cracked by now." Sarah smiled faintly. "I guess I'm used to high-pressure environments." Though at the diner, the stakes were usually burnt pancakes, not multi-million-dollar deals. Lucas laughed, a genuine, deep laugh that made her chest tighten. It was the first time she had seen him so unguarded, and it left her momentarily speechless. "You have a way of putting things in perspective," he said, his expression softening. "It's refreshing." The moment lingered, the air between them charged with something unspoken. But before either of them could say more, Daniel entered the room, breaking the spell. Despite her growing confidence in the role, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Miranda, a senior executive with a reputation for ruthlessness, seemed particularly interested in her. One afternoon, Miranda cornered Sarah in the break room, her sharp heels clicking against the tile floor. "So," Miranda began, her tone deceptively casual, "you're the one who's got Lucas's attention." Sarah stiffened. "I'm just his assistant." Miranda's lips curved into a sly smile. Assistant or not, you've managed to do something most people can't. Get close to him. Be careful, though. This world isn't as forgiving as it looks. The warning was clear, but Sarah refused to let it intimidate her. She met Miranda's gaze head-on. I'm here to do my job. That's all. Miranda studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. Let's keep it that way. As Miranda walked away, Sarah felt a mix of relief and unease. It was clear that earning her place in this world would take more than hard work. It would require resilience, strength, and a willingness to face whatever challenges came her way. Late one night, as Sarah prepared to leave the office, she found Lucas standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows in his office, staring out at the city lights. He looked lost in thought, his usually composed facade tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or loneliness. Lucas, she called softly. He turned, his expression unreadable. Sarah, still here? Just finishing up, she said, stepping into the room. Are you okay? He hesitated, then let out a weary sigh. Sometimes, I wonder if all of this is worth it. The success, the accolades, it's a lot to carry. Sarah hesitated before speaking. You don't have to carry it alone. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Lucas's guarded demeanor slipped. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. Thank you, he said quietly, for reminding me of that. As Sarah left the office that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her connection with Lucas was deepening, shifting into something neither of them fully understood. But with every step she took into his world, she knew the stakes were only getting higher. Fractures in the foundation. The next month at Hastings Industries brought a whirlwind of challenges, triumphs, and quiet moments of clarity for Sarah. Her role had grown from merely managing Lucas's schedule to being his confidant in a world that constantly demanded more from him than he seemed willing to give. She had started to see the cracks in the foundation of his polished persona, small glimpses of vulnerability that hinted at the toll his success had taken on him. But for all the progress Sarah had made in finding her footing, the weight of the job, and the unspoken tension between her and Lucas began to take its toll. One Thursday morning, Sarah arrived at the office to find a series of frantic emails waiting in her inbox. A critical deal with an international partner was on the brink of collapse due to a last-minute renegotiation demand. The board was in an uproar, and Lucas had been summoned to an emergency meeting. Sarah spent the better part of the morning fielding calls, coordinating with the legal team, and trying to find a solution that wouldn't jeopardize the company's position. By the time Lucas returned from the boardroom, his expression was grim. Walk with me, he said curtly, striding past her desk. Sarah grabbed her tablet and followed him to the executive conference room, where the team responsible for the deal was already assembled. Lucas's frustration was palpable as he addressed the group, his tone sharp and unyielding. This deal is critical, he said, his voice commanding. We cannot afford to lose it. I need options. Now. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Sarah felt the pressure mounting as the team scrambled to present solutions. Finally, she spoke up, her voice steady despite the nerves tightening in her chest. What if we propose a phased implementation plan? She suggested. It would give the partner time to assess the initial results without committing to the full scope right away. It's a compromise that shows flexibility without undermining our position. The room fell silent, all eyes on Lucas as he considered her words. After a moment, he nodded. Draft the proposal, he said to one of the team members before turning to Sarah. Good thinking. The praise was fleeting, but it lit a spark of confidence in her. Yet, as the team dispersed and Lucas turned back to her, his expression softened. Thank you, he said quietly, for staying calm under pressure. It's part of the job, Sarah replied with a faint smile, though the encounter left her shaken. She couldn't help but notice the cracks in Lucas's resolve, the way the weight of his responsibilities seemed to press harder on him with each passing day. Later that evening, Sarah stayed late at the office, finishing up the final touches on the proposal. The building was nearly empty, its usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie silence. As she worked, she heard the faint sound of footsteps and looked up to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder. "Still here?" he asked, his tone light but tinged with exhaustion. "Just wrapping up," she said, leaning back in her chair. "You should go home. You've been going nonstop all day." Lucas chuckled softly, stepping into the room. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing to you." Sarah smiled, but the moment felt heavy, as if they were both skirting around something neither wanted to say out loud. "You know," Lucas began, leaning against the edge of the table, "when I started this company, I thought success would solve everything. But the higher you climb, the lonelier it gets." His words caught her off guard, and she hesitated before responding. "You don't have to do it alone. You've built a team, people who want to help you. Maybe you just need to let them in." Lucas studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "That's easier said than done." "I know," Sarah said softly. "But you're human, Lucas. You can't carry everything on your shoulders forever." For a fleeting moment, the guarded facade Lucas always wore seemed to slip, and Sarah saw a glimpse of the man beneath the armor, vulnerable, weary, but still fighting to keep going. The following week, Sarah began to notice changes in the office dynamic. Whispers circulated about the board's dissatisfaction with Lucas's leadership style, and rumors of internal power struggles began to surface. Miranda, in particular, seemed to be positioning herself as a rival, her subtle barbs during meetings growing more pointed. One afternoon, as Sarah was organizing Lucas's schedule, Miranda stopped by her desk. "You're working hard," Miranda said, her tone deceptively friendly. "But I hope you're not getting too comfortable." Sarah frowned, looking up from her computer. "What's that supposed to mean?" Miranda leaned in slightly, her smile sharp. "Just a word of advice. Loyalty to one person can be dangerous in a place like this. Lucas isn't untouchable, no matter how brilliant he is." The warning sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She knew Miranda was angling for something, perhaps Lucas's position, but the idea of someone actively working against him was unsettling. As tensions in the office escalated, Sarah found herself caught in a crossfire. One evening, Lucas called her into his office, his expression unreadable. "I need to ask you something," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "What's going on?" she asked, her stomach twisting with unease. "There's been talk among the board," Lucas said, his tone measured. "They're concerned about the direction of the company. Miranda's been vocal about her opinions." Sarah's heart sank. "What does that mean for you?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "It means I have to be careful. One wrong move, and they'll push for a vote of no confidence." The weight of his words hit her like a freight train. Lucas was more than her boss. He had become a friend, someone she admired deeply. The thought of him losing everything he had built was unbearable. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Lucas's lips curved into a faint smile. "Just keep being you. You're one of the few people I can trust right now." The sincerity in his words left her breathless, and she nodded, determined to stand by him no matter what. That night, as Sarah left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm brewing at Hastings Industries was only just beginning. The stakes were higher than ever, and the cracks in the foundation were growing. But for the first time, Sarah felt a sense of purpose, an unwavering resolve to fight for what she believed in. What she didn't know was that the battles ahead would test her in ways she couldn't imagine, pushing her loyalty, her strength, and her heart to the limit. The storm breaks. The tension in the air at Hastings Industries had grown so thick that Sarah felt it as soon as she walked into the building each morning. The whispered conversations, the sidelong glances, and the subtle shifts in behavior told her that something was coming. Something big. It was as if the entire company was bracing for impact, and Sarah found herself squarely in the eye of the storm. It began with a board meeting. Lucas had summoned Sarah to help prepare, but as she stepped into the room, she quickly realized this was no ordinary discussion. The board members sat around the sleek oval table, their faces stern and unyielding. Miranda was there, seated strategically near the center, her gaze fixed on Lucas with an intensity that made Sarah's stomach churn. Lucas stood at the head of the table, his usual calm demeanor in place, though Sarah could see the tightness in his jaw. She took a seat along the wall, her tablet in hand, ready to take notes but acutely aware of the gravity of the situation. This company was built on a foundation of innovation. Miranda began, her voice crisp and confident. But lately, it seems we've been more reactive than proactive. The recent turbulence with our international partner is just one example. We need stronger leadership. The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Sarah's chest tightened as she glanced at Lucas, who remained impassive, his hands resting on the table. "If you have something to say, Miranda, say it," Lucas said, his tone calm but laced with steel. Miranda's lips curved into a faint smile. "With all due respect, Lucas, I believe the board should consider a vote of no confidence. It's time we evaluated whether you're the right person to lead Hastings Industries into the future." Gasps rippled around the room. Sarah's hands clenched the tablet in her lap, her heart pounding. She wanted to stand up and defend Lucas, to shout down Miranda's calculated attack, but she knew this wasn't her battle to fight, not directly. Lucas didn't flinch. "You're entitled to your opinion, Miranda," he said, his voice steady. "But let me remind you of something. Hastings Industries is more than a corporation. It's a vision I've built with my own two hands. If you think you can do better, prove it. But don't think for a second that I'll step aside without a fight." The meeting ended in a stalemate, but the seeds of division had been sown. As Sarah followed Lucas back to his office, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Lucas, this is serious," she said, closing the door behind them. "What are we going to do?" He sat down heavily in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he looked genuinely tired. "We're going to keep doing what we do best," he said after a moment. "Prove them wrong with results." The following weeks were some of the most intense of Sarah's life. Lucas threw himself into work with a renewed determination, launching a series of initiatives designed to solidify Hastings Industries' position in the market. Sarah worked tirelessly by his side, coordinating projects, fielding inquiries, and managing the mounting pressure with a quiet resilience that earned her respect even from Miranda's camp. But the battle wasn't just professional, it was personal. Late one evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the office, she found Lucas sitting alone in his office, staring out the window at the glittering cityscape. The room was dark, save for the glow of his computer screen and the soft light from the street lamps outside. "Lucas," she said hesitantly. He turned, his expression unreadable. "You should go home. It's late." "So should you," she replied, stepping closer. "You've been running yourself into the ground." He let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, you're the second person to tell me that today." "Maybe because it's true," Sarah said softly. She hesitated, then added, "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Lucas looked at her, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. "You don't understand, Sarah. This company isn't just my legacy. It's my father's. Everything I've done has been to prove I'm worthy of carrying his name. If I fail—" "You won't," she interrupted, her voice firm. "You're the most capable person I've ever met, Lucas, but even the strongest people need help sometimes." The words seemed to reach him, and for a moment, the walls he had built around himself seemed to crumble. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for always believing in me." As the weeks turned into months, the storm Miranda had unleashed reached its peak. A critical deal with an international partner, a deal Sarah had helped salvage, was finalized, bolstering the company's reputation and securing Lucas's position for the time being. But the tension between Lucas and Miranda continued to simmer, an unspoken war that colored every interaction. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Sarah found herself standing by the office balcony, gazing out at the city lights. She barely noticed Lucas approaching until he spoke. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice low. She turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat at the closeness between them. "It is," she replied softly. "But it feels distant." Lucas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "That's the thing about power," he said. "It isolates you. The higher you climb, the fewer people you can trust." "You don't have to isolate yourself," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "You have people who care about you, people who want to help." He looked at her then, his blue eyes searching hers. "Like you?" The question hung in the air, charged with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes," she whispered. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. Then, slowly, Lucas reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and something deeper. "I don't deserve your loyalty, Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I'm grateful for it." She shook her head. "It's not about deserving. It's about believing in you." The following day, as Sarah entered the office, she was met with a flurry of activity. A major announcement was scheduled for later that afternoon, and the entire company was abuzz with speculation. When Sarah finally made her way to Lucas's office, she found him seated at his desk, reviewing notes for his speech. "You're ready for this," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "I am. Thanks to you." The announcement was a resounding success. Lucas unveiled a groundbreaking initiative that not only silenced his critics, but also positioned Hastings Industries as a leader in innovation. The applause that followed was thunderous, but as Lucas stepped off the stage, his first glance wasn't at the board or the media, it was at Sarah. That night, as they stood together on the balcony once more, Lucas turned to her, his expression unguarded. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. Sarah smiled, her heart full. "You didn't need me, Lucas. You've always had it in you." He shook his head. "No, Sarah. You've given me something I didn't know I needed. Hope, trust, and something more." She met his gaze, her breath catching. In that moment, the weight of their journey together, the struggles, the triumphs, the unspoken connection, came crashing down. And as Lucas reached for her hand, Sarah knew that the storm had not only tested them, but had brought them closer than she ever thought possible. The world ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, neither of them would face it alone. The calm after the storm. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Lucas's bold new initiative took off. Hastings Industries thrived under his leadership, silencing the doubters and solidifying his position at the helm. Yet, amidst the chaos of his professional resurgence, Lucas and Sarah found themselves navigating an uncharted path, one that blurred the lines between trust, partnership, and something far deeper. One quiet evening, Sarah found herself at Lucas's penthouse apartment for the first time. He had invited her over for a private dinner to celebrate the company's recent success, insisting it was the least he could do after everything she had done for him. The space was as sleek and sophisticated as she had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city, minimalist decor that exuded elegance, and a warmth that surprised her. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," Sarah said as Lucas poured her a glass of wine. "I wanted to," he replied simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The dinner was intimate but relaxed, their conversation flowing effortlessly. They talked about everything: Hastings Industries, the challenges they had faced, and the moments that had defined them both. For the first time, Lucas shared stories from his childhood, tales of a demanding father who had instilled in him a relentless drive to succeed. "I spent my whole life trying to live up to his expectations," Lucas admitted, his voice tinged with a mix of regret and defiance. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what I wanted, who I wanted to be." Sarah reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "You found your way back," she said softly. "And you've built something incredible, not just for yourself, but for everyone who believes in you." Lucas looked at her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah." Her breath caught as he stood and walked around the table, his presence magnetic. "You've been my anchor," he said, his voice low. "When everything else felt uncertain, you were the one thing I could count on." "Lucas," she began, her voice trembling. "I mean it," he interrupted, kneeling in front of her so their eyes were level. "I've spent my life surrounded by people who want something from me. But you gave without asking for anything in return. You saw me when no one else did." The vulnerability in his words shattered the walls Sarah had carefully built around her own heart. She placed her hand on his cheek, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Because you're worth seeing, Lucas, and you're not alone anymore." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings that had been building for months. Slowly, as if testing the waters, Lucas leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. The days that followed marked a new chapter in their relationship. They navigated the delicate balance of maintaining their professional roles while exploring the undeniable connection between them. Lucas, ever the private figure, was cautious about revealing their relationship to the world, but with Sarah, he found a freedom he hadn't known before. At Hastings Industries, their dynamic remained as strong as ever. Sarah's growing confidence and ability to handle high-pressure situations earned her the respect of even her harshest critics, including Miranda, who begrudgingly acknowledged her value. "You've surprised me, Sarah," Miranda said one day, her tone less sharp than usual. "I didn't think you'd last, but you've proven me wrong." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here to stay." One afternoon, as Sarah was organizing Lucas's schedule, Daniel appeared at her desk with a folder in hand. "This just came in," he said, his tone unusually upbeat. "You're going to want to see it." Sarah opened the folder to find a series of glowing reports about the success of the new initiative. The numbers were staggering, exceeding even the most optimistic projections. "This is incredible," she said, glancing up at Daniel. "Lucas wanted you to have the first look," Daniel replied with a knowing smile. "He said you've earned it." Later that evening, Sarah found Lucas in his office, staring out at the city lights as he often did when deep in thought. "Good news," she said, holding up the folder. "The numbers are in, and they're better than we ever imagined." Lucas turned to her, a rare smile breaking across his face. "That's because of you," he said, walking toward her. "You've been with me through all of this. The highs, the lows, everything. I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah shook her head, her smile soft. "You give me too much credit." "No," Lucas said firmly. "I don't give you enough." He took her hands in his gaze unwavering. "You've changed my life, Sarah. You've reminded me of what matters: trust, connection, and believing in something bigger than myself. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes as his words sank in. "You won't," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Months later, as Sarah stood beside Lucas at a gala celebrating Hastings Industries' latest success, she marveled at how much her life had changed. The woman who had once been a struggling waitress now stood confidently among the city's elite, her head held high. Lucas leaned close, his voice a quiet murmur in her ear. "You belong here, you know. Not because of me, but because of who you are." She smiled, her heart full. "I found my place, Lucas, and it's with you." As the evening wore on, Sarah realized that the journey she and Lucas had taken together had been about more than saving a stranger or building a company. It had been about finding themselves and each other amid the chaos. And as they faced the future, hand in hand, Sarah knew that the storms they had weathered had only made them stronger. Together, they were unstoppable.